She dressed the brightest stars and kept their deepest secrets. Hollywood's most famous costume designer, Edith Head, tonight on Hollywood Fashion Machine. Edith Head said the art of costume design was the art of illusion, and she was perhaps the greatest illusionist of them all. From her first day in Hollywood to her last, Edith Head invented herself and everything around her. She didn't just dress the stars, she transformed them. She also used her considerable powers of illusion to transform herself from a humble school teacher into a star. A brilliant self-promoter and a tireless worker, Edith Head broke into an exclusively male enclave and turned it on its head, outlasting and outdesigning everyone around her. Tonight, we reveal the truth, the myth, and the magic of Edith Head.
A studio costume designer is to create an illusion of changing an actor and actress into what they aren't. What we do a cross between magic and camouflage.
In a career spanning over 50 years, Edith Head won 8 Academy Awards, and by her count worked on 1,131 movies. From Mae West to Grace Kelly, she dressed the stars and tended their secrets. From DeMille to Hitchcock, she calmed directors' nerves and fabricated their dreams. From Dorothy Lamore's sarong to Elizabeth Taylor's debutante gown, she created fashion trends and became known as America's dress doctor. How did this shy, unassuming daughter of a mining engineer go from high school teacher to world-renowned costume designer? She lied.
When she first started into the business, she had been in design school, and she saw this ad in the paper.
It was 1924, just 4 years after women got the vote. Edith Head was a school teacher, but she wanted more, much more. While taking art classes, she saw an ad for a sketch artist on the Paramount lot.
She wasn't good at drawing the human body. So she went to her fellow students and basically created a portfolio.
She borrowed sketches from everybody. Oil paintings, architectural renderings, everything she could find, erased the original name on it and wrote Head.
I didn't steal them. I asked everybody in the class for a few sketches on costume design, and I had the most fantastic assortment you've ever seen in your life. I thought it was rather amusing. It never occurred to me it was quite dishonest.
She was hired on the spot by then costume department head Howard Greer.
Well, within a few days, it became known that she not only hadn't done those sketches, but she couldn't really draw at all. And this was just what Greer wanted, because he didn't want somebody that would someday replace him.
Ultimately, she would go on to replace both Howard Greer and Travis Banton. People underestimated Edith Head. She may not have been the best sketch artist, but she was brilliant in other ways. She was savvy and she was tenacious.
She was not a costume designer, but she was a fast learner. Working with people like Howard Greer and Travis Banton, all she had to do was know what the director wanted, what the star wanted, and how the story flowed.
Edith understood from the start that in Hollywood's celebrity system, she had to design for the stars to succeed. But the stars were reserved for her bosses, Greer and Banton. Edith was stuck dressing the bit parts and the small players. But when she finally got her chance, she jumped at it. The studio, suffering during the Depression, needed a hit. And then Hollywood wannabe Mae West rode into town, providing the perfect vehicle for both.
Why don't you come up sometime, see me?
Mae West spelled it out for Head. telling her to make her clothes loose enough to prove I'm a lady, but tight enough to show 'em I'm a woman.
A little bit spicy, but not too raw, you know what I mean?
Head turned it out. The film was a box office smash that not only turned around Paramount's fortunes, but also jump-started Edith's career. Her star steadily rose, and in 1938, after both Greer and Banton had left Paramount, Edith Head became the first female head of the studio costume department.
Edith was an executive woman long before the concept of executive women ever existed. She knew how to manage the costume design department. She was really a producer of sorts.
Cut from a very different cloth from her mostly male contemporaries, Edith Head brought a unique philosophy to costume design, one she would stick to her entire career.
It's one of the most exciting and also difficult professions in the entire world because it's not just straight costume design, it's also camouflage. I can make you look taller or shorter, fatter or thinner. I can even make you look younger. So you see, what I do isn't really just designing. What I really do is magic.
At the time, most successful costume designers were men, like Erté and Adrian, famous for extravagant costumes that stole the scene.
When Adrian did a movie, the world knew that it was going to be spectacular, that the costumes were going to be memorable, that the costumes would almost outshine the stars.
The older costume designers were trained in the silent era. Edith knew that with the advent of sound, the actors, not the costumes, would ultimately do the talking.
Edith always did something different. She costumed the girl next door.
A short 1939 film called The Costume Designer showcased Edith's philosophy and working methods.
Let's see now. The girl is young, about 20. Her sweetheart has just left her after a quarrel. How would she dress? Somberly because she's unhappy about the quarrel? I wonder if I shouldn't dress her in a manner to help cover up her unhappiness.
Edith argued that the stars were the stars, and the clothes were there to play supporting roles.
But wait a minute. We don't want the audience to be more interested in the gown than in the character of the scene. Better make the gown less extreme so it won't detract from the girl.
I think what gives Edith her reputation as a very classic designer is that she uses very, very simple lines in the clothing. Nothing is ruffled and bowed.
But the secret of Edith Head's success was less about simplicity and more about intimacy. By becoming intimate with the stars and addressing their insecurities, she gained their confidence to such an extent that they often allowed her to utterly transform their images. A classic example is the way she completely remade Barbara Stanwyck.
Barbara Stanwyck had been a movie star and an important one for 10 years, but she never thought of herself as glamorous. She had quite a long waist, and besides that, her rear end was very low. And in the Lady Eve, she had to wear a lot of really glamorous, sexy clothes. The problem was to somehow make her waist a little higher, and also to sort of fill in her long backside. What Edith did was to come up with a belt that was wider in the front than it was in the back, and to place it a little bit higher than Stanwyck's natural waist.
Gee, you look lovely.
Thank you.
Barbara Stanwyck adored what Head did, and they became close friends. This would become a pattern repeated with many of the stars that Edith designed for and collected. Her reward was their loyalty.
A lot of people had it written in their contract that Edith had to do her wardrobe. Claudette Colbert, Barbara Stanwyck, Jane Wyman.
It was a perfect match. We were absolutely melded. In one of the Crosby shows, I had a very ticklish thing where I had to have a gown that on the stage I would zip off and it would work into tights. Now that's pretty tough. I said, how are we going to do that and make it look not like a piece of underwear, you know? So she worked it out. She got it all worked out, so all I had to do was just unzip it and step out of it and go right into the number.
He's just crazy for me.
Edith was happy to perform double duty for her stars, not just designing their costumes, but creating personal wardrobes for them as well.
They had this wonderful wardrobe that Edith had designed, and it was done for me for publicity purposes and for my own use also.
T16, take one.
I can wear this dress today, and everybody would say it was absolutely current.
Edith designed personal wardrobes not just for Hedren, but for a whole host of stars. This clever strategy made Edith far more indispensable than a mere costume designer.
She was the older sister or the mother. The role that she had, almost like a doctor, it was very important, and she played it very well.
She would divine what your special quality was and just feed it back to you, and you couldn't help but love her.
Edith had a particular soft spot for Grace Kelly. They shopped together in Paris, and Edith felt that the clothes that she designed for her in To Catch a Thief were some of her finest.
They were close, very close friends. The only time that I really saw Edith Head upset was when Grace Kelly did not let her do her wedding gown.
Edith was not too happy about any of this. And Grace Kelly said, well, MGM's paying for the dress. Would Paramount pay for it? And Edith had to admit that she didn't think Paramount would, so end of discussion. Well, she did the going away outfit, but of course that was, you know, very much the second prize.
But Edith was careful to keep her feelings to herself.
Of course, you know I lie a lot. In a way, you have to. You have no idea what a vocabulary you finally get in motion pictures of charming things to say.
Edith was so wary of upstaging her stars that at fittings she only wore black, white, or beige.
I think that people like myself are what you call the background.
Edith's burning ambition wouldn't allow her to remain in the background forever. But could the dowdy school teacher really reinvent herself as a star? Could the master of illusion work that same magic on herself? Find out when Hollywood Fashion Machine continues. On Academy Award night in 1948, it snowed in Hollywood, and Edith Head was in high spirits. She was convinced she was about to win the first Oscar ever awarded for costume design. Edith had launched a personal campaign to get the Academy to recognize costume design, a savvy career move that would raise the status of both her profession and herself.
She even proposed that there be a separate Academy Award for costume design for each studio. But of course, if that had happened, she would be sure to win every year because she did all the Paramount pictures.
That Oscar night in 1948, Edith Head did not win. But she would more than make up for it with a 6-year winning streak for her work on The Heiress, Samson and Delilah, All About Eve, A Place in the Sun, Roman Holiday, and Sabrina. In the midst of all this acclaim, Edith faced her biggest challenge of her career, Audrey Hepburn.
Now, this is an actual test. This was made in England, flown to me here in Hollywood. It was my first acquaintance with Audrey Hepburn, and as you'll see, it's pretty successful.
When they first met, Head was convinced theirs would be one of the great pairings of Hollywood, the crowning achievement of her career. She threw herself enthusiastically into screen testing costumes for Roman Holiday. But from the outset, the relationship would be a battle of wills.
When Edith first laid eyes on Audrey, she wanted to change her. She wanted to pad out her thin figure. She wanted to hide her skinny legs. But Audrey Hepburn had a very determined attitude about how she should look. She liked the fact that she looked different, and she convinced Edith that it would work.
Once more, Edith would take the strategic route and brilliantly adapt to the whims of her star. The costumes that Edith created for Roman Holiday were classic Head and demonstrated her unquestionable talent for adapting and surviving. But Hepburn's next film, Sabrina, would be a major disappointment for Head. When the director, Billy Wilder, suggested that Hepburn wear something from Paris, it was a major slap in the face for Edith. In Paris, Hepburn met Givenchy and fell in love with his designs.
Sabrina,
His Highness?
can you keep a secret?
Secret?
Givenchy designed both the little black dress and the satin gown that stole the film. Head may have been down, but she wasn't out. She never complained about Givenchy's involvement, but when she won the Academy Award for Sabrina, she never shared the credit either.
Well, I think she had a lot of gall for one thing, and another thing is she had a contract with the studio. Everything that was done at that studio, she got credit. And they couldn't dispute it. I don't care if the clothes were made in Paris.
From the day she got her start in Hollywood, Edith had never had any scruples about taking the credit, even if it was sometimes for other people's work. If that's what it took to succeed, she was more than willing. But success was going to be harder to come by now.
She saw that the studio system in Hollywood was changing. She knew that eventually studios wouldn't be hiring designers on staff. Her situation would be very, very different.
But once again, Edith was prepared. After 30 years of creating stars, she became one herself. She applied to herself the same techniques of camouflage and illusion that she lavished to such great effect on her stars. She packaged herself, creating a look that never changed.
Edith had her own trademark in person. She was always immaculately dressed, tailored, usually in suits, and she always had bangs, and she wore glasses slightly tinted.
And of course, that way, with the dark glasses on, nobody could ever see her expression. They could never know what she was thinking.
And she never changed her look. She always wore the glasses, she always wore the bangs, and she always, looked the same, always.
Ironically, it was a look born out of insecurity. Head wore dark glasses because she was self-conscious about her deep-set eyes. But it was a look that projected a professional cool, rare for women at that time.
I can remember once working on a picture with her, and I know she hadn't read the script. I could tell she hadn't read the script. But we had a little meeting, and after she left, the producer said, "Oh, what a professional." She just gave off this quality.
With the image down, Edith concentrated on building Edith Inc. into a one-woman industry.
Come on in. It's Art Linkletter's house party.
After an initial appearance on the Art Linkletter show, she became a regular.
Edith Head came into people's living rooms doing makeovers before their very eyes.
Well, I don't think anything is so particularly wrong with his clothes, except his trousers sag a little in the back.
They started to respect her and really wanted to be able to dress the way Edith Head would advise them to dress. She was the dress doctor.
Playing up to her public image, Edith wrote a bestseller of the same title. She sold her patterns to Vogue, launched a retail line, collected product endorsements.
She became one of our stars, literally, not only a star in fashion, but a star for magazines, for television, for every form of media.
But as virtually every studio dismisses its full-time costume designers, can her brilliant strategy succeed? Can stardom keep her on top of an industry that's intent on downsizing? Find out when Edith Head continues on Hollywood Fashion Machine. By 1955, thanks to Edith's tireless drive and her single-mindedness, a star had been born. She was 58 years old when she starred in her first film, by which time she was more than famous enough to play herself.
Now I'd like to introduce to you our guest commentator for today, the world-famous designer, Miss Edith Head.
Thank you, Miss Gallant. The fabrics used in this collection come from all over the world.
For example, these oilskins were originally used by Gloucester fishermen and come from our New England coast.
We got tons of fan mail at the studio wanting Edith to come to different cities for different charities and commentate a fashion show. And she accepted some, as many as she could.
Her stint in the movies and the fame that it brought her spurred Edith to greater heights of self-promotion. She toured the country doing fashion shows with the gowns from her movies. These fashion shows were hugely popular. Sometimes even the stars themselves turned out to walk her runway.
Will we be seeing some stars modeling these today?
Oh, didn't you know? There's not a professional model in the group. Every one of these are stars.
She was bringing a little bit of Hollywood right into the room where the women could go up and look at the dresses, ask her about the gowns, ask which gowns would look best on them. It was a bit of fantasy that came right to the women, and they loved it. I think she was still doing it the year that she died.
By the mid-60s, after almost half a century at Paramount, Edith's contract expired and was not renewed. The era of the full-time studio designer seemed over, but not the era of Edith Head. Her strategy of making herself over as a star paid off, as Universal snapped her up, consolidating her fame still further by making her bungalow a stop on the Universal tour.
At Universal, she had her own bungalow, and she was a stop point on the tram for the tour. Every tourist on the tram would take out their camera trying to see who was walking in to see Edith Head.
Still a tireless workhorse, Edith continued to work into her 80s on a host of major films.
Edith Head worked up till she was 85 years old. She had the same enthusiasm when she was in her 80s as she had when she was in her 50s.
In spite of her public profile, there was a very private, even very hidden side to Edith Head. When not working, she spent her time quietly in her beloved Hollywood home, Casa Ladera. Shedding her colorless work uniform, Edith wore bright colors around the house. In spite of, or perhaps because of, her carefully constructed image, the real Edith Head remains private and unknown, even today. Perhaps Edith Head never meant for us to learn her secrets. Even on her deathbed, Hollywood's greatest illusionist was still at work dispensing career tips to the living and insisting that the secret of success was to withhold the truth.
She had been in the hospital for a while, and one day I called her up. And rather abruptly, she said, "Honey, you've got to get out of this movie business because you don't know how to lie well enough." And that night she died.
Her funeral validated the legend that Edith worked for a lifetime to build, and the stars came out to pay tribute.
It was like a movie. The church was packed, and in her greatest performance, Bette Davis said, "Edith Head, the queen of Hollywood designers, the greatest costume designer that there's ever been."
A few weeks after the funeral, author Paddy Calistro visited Edith's house and stumbled across a box of tapes Edith had prepared for her autobiography.
The tapes were filled with Edithisms, lies, some people would call them. Anybody that knew Edith knew that you might not get the same story twice, unless she liked that story, and then that continued and became legend.
I think that I have been tremendously lucky because I've had a wonderful, wonderful career. I've dressed the greatest stars in the world. I've worked with the greatest producers, the greatest directors. I think you work very hard for what you get, and it is not an easy job, but it's fascinating.
In the end, Edith Head herself became a legend in Hollywood. Whatever her private truth, her public legacy stands as not only Hollywood's greatest costume designer, but one of its most unlikely giants. A little lady in bangs and dark glasses who remains as glamorous, as alluring, and ultimately as mysterious as the stars that she dressed.